The Industrial Revolution, as an economic and technological force, had amazing sort of ramifications. Britain was massively productive, was making lots of money, was transforming the economic landscape. The Industrial Revolution also, though, had some fairly significant social impacts, both good and bad. Britain would never be the same, though, after this. In the Industrial Revolution, you have winners and losers, like in almost anything. The countries that tended to pile on to the Industrial Revolution first were the northern and western Atlantic-based European and American countries. So Britain leads the way, followed by the Germans, the French, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Americans. Later on, to a lesser extent, some of the southern and eastern European countries will get in, certainly the urban areas. I mean, Austria a little bit, Russia a little bit, the northern Italy some. And so you've got national winners, mostly in the north and western part of Europe and the United States. Southern and eastern Europe remain primarily raw resource producers. They stay heavily agricultural. The economy is still much more tied to a sort of aristocratic and peasant class. For Britain, not so much. The peasants have become laborers, a working class. We'll get to them in just a minute. Another big winner, one of the things that we see happen in the 19th century is that urban areas, especially in these countries that are being impacted, explode in size. London was already huge, but London becomes massive as a result of the Industrial Revolution. But so does Paris, so does Berlin, so do East Coast American cities. The big urban areas, with the invention of the steam engine and the movement of the factories to the locations of the populations, mean that the urban centers are going to get huge. And they're going to come with a lot of problems. We'll talk about those in a later chapter. But you've got massive population relocation. In a lot of these same places, especially England that we talked about before, but to a certain extent in all these other countries, we're going to see relocation from within the country, not just immigration from other nations, but inside the countries, you're going to see the rural populations starting to move to town as the emphasis becomes on factory work, on wage labor, and as, in all honesty, the Industrial Revolution begins to produce a lot of the machinery that's going to be labor saving on the farm, you just don't need as many rural workers anymore. And for England, they literally move away from an agricultural economy. Instead of trying to produce all the food they need for themselves, they start importing it. They pass corn laws, these tariff protections to protect the big farmers, the big landowners, and those last for a little while until the bread prices that they create get so high that the workers revolt. But for the most part, England's going to cash in on its agricultural economy and move to town. And the population certainly is going to go that way. Big industry also is going to create a massive workforce. Now, you're going to have winners in the ownership column. I mean, one of the things about the Industrial Revolution is that, unlike the old artisan craftsman sort of work, where you had a craftsman working with a few journeymen and some apprentices, and they were all under one roof, and they knew each other, and there was maybe some hope that you could move up the line and become a craftsman yourself, or the apprentices would become journeymen and get jobs on their own. But everybody knew each other, everybody was in the same household. These new industries, these new factories, a lot of times the ownership or the stockholders are going to be remote. The workers are never going to meet them. And this is going to create a wealthy property class that isn't really intimately connected with the production facilities. So you're going to have a wealthy population that isn't necessarily on site. The people who are on site, what comes to be called as the 19th century progresses, the middle class, will be a managerial class. It will be foremen. It will be shift operators, supervisors. You'll have a certain amount of clerical or accounting work that you're going to need professionals for. You'll have factory managers who are going to be in there. And so a talented or educated middle class that earns a little bit more than the working class, that has a little bit more stable position in this, is going to arise. And these will be winners. Not as big a winners as the wealthy, but they'll be winners. You will also have, for the first time in British society, in many of these societies, a permanent wage-dependent working class. Now, for a lot of these people, I mean, that sounds like not too bad of an operation, but for a lot of them, this is sort of, well, it's the kind of thing we would call a gig economy today. Factories would hire in, during the right seasons, massive teams of workers at very low wages and would work them 10, 12 hours a day, sometimes more, 5 to 6 days a week. And the wages were enough to get by, but even then you saw working class families move into the factories. Husbands, wives, and children working side by side. Women and children made less than men, so it was actually very tempting for factory owners to try to employ lots of them. But the work wasn't steady. There were layoffs, there were shutdowns, there were slowdowns. And so oftentimes these people were thrown out of work. The problem that you get with that is that as a wage-dependent population with no other real means of support in an urban environment, there's nothing for them to fall back on. And so you wind up with crowded, overpopulated, very poor urban areas that suffer problems like crime and prostitution and other corruptions that wind up becoming part and parcel of this industrial growth. One of the other groups that gets hurt are the old artisans. One of the side effects of mass production in the Industrial Revolution is that mass production lends itself to less craftsmanship, a less singularly individualistic piece of work. If you're going to create lots of items in short periods of time, that's going to require fairly simplistic, mechanized processes. And the losers in that, as far as the working class is concerned, are the old artisans. The guilds that they were part of, the operations that they used to run to maintain quality control, to keep control over their industries, are going to fall apart, and factory labor is going to replace them. Now, factory laborers will eventually organize themselves also, but we'll talk about that again in a later chapter as well.